The ICU of Meridian General was Grace Okonkwo's kingdom, and she ran it the way she ran everything, with absolute, unquestioned precision. Not loudly. Grace was not a loud person. She had learned, in a context that had nothing to do with nursing, that volume was a tool of the weak. The strong arranged the room so that the room did the work for them. They controlled the variables before the variables needed controlling. They saw what was coming before it arrived and positioned themselves accordingly. Not because they were gifted with foresight, but because they had learned, in specific and irreversible ways, to read a situation down to its bones. At 44, Grace was the oldest charge nurse on the ICU floor and the one with the fewest sick days in Meridian General's 11-year institutional memory. Tall, 6 feet in flat shoes, with close-cropped natural hair and the particular stillness of someone who had decided, at some point in their past, that stillness was the most powerful thing they could project. She wore no jewelry. She carried no unnecessary items. Her pockets contained exactly what she needed and nothing else, organized in the same order every shift, every day for 2 years, 1 month, and 17 days. The staff called her unshakable. They meant it as a compliment. They also meant it as a warning. Mrs. Patterson in 412 needs her morning labs redrawn, Grace said, moving through the ICU corridor at her standard pace. Not fast, not slow, the pace of someone who has calculated the exact speed at which efficiency and calm coexist. The night tech mislabeled the potassium tube. Redo it here, don't send it down. In room 408, Mr. Diaz. His family has been in the waiting room since 0400. They haven't been updated since the night shift handoff. For hours. She looked at the junior nurse beside her, a second-year named Preeti, without breaking stride. What do you think Mr. Diaz's family is feeling right now? Preeti hesitated. Worried, terrified, Grace said. There's a difference. Worried is what you feel when your child is late coming home from school. Terrified is what you feel when the person you love most in the world is on a ventilator and nobody has spoken to you in 4 hours. She handed Preeti the Diaz chart without stopping. You're going to go speak to them. Not a resident. Not a PA. You're going to sit down, make eye contact, and tell them exactly what you know and exactly what you don't. Then you're going to ask if they have questions. A beat. That is the job. The machines keep people alive. We keep them human. Preeti took the chart. She went. Grace returned to the board. 12 patients. 4 vented. 2 post-surgical. 1 waiting for a cardiac transfer delayed twice by bed availability. She ran the board the way she ran everything. The way she had once run something else entirely, in a place where the stakes of misreading a situation were measured not in patient outcomes, but in body counts. She did not think about that place. She had not thought about it in 2 years, 1 month, and 17 days. The new patient arrived at 0743. He came from the ER, a transfer, which was unusual this early. ER liked to hold patients until the morning attending had done rounds, which meant ICU transfers before 8 were either very sick or very complicated. Usually both. Grace met the transport team at the ICU entrance. Herself, personally. She always did. The man on the gurney was perhaps 60, perhaps older. It was difficult to tell, because the kind of life that leaves marks on a face the way his had been marked tended to compress the visible evidence of age into something that read as simply old, the way soldiers read as simply old once they had been in enough places. His skin was the deep brown of someone who had spent years outdoors in intense sun. His hands, resting at his sides, carried the specific callous pattern of someone who had spent those years doing something considerably more demanding than agriculture or construction. Grace noticed the hands. She always noticed the hands. The ER physician handed her the transfer paperwork while walking alongside the gurney. 62-year-old male, found unresponsive in his hotel room by housekeeping. GCS of 9 on arrival, improved to 14 with oxygen. No ID, no phone, no next of kin. The hotel registered him under a name that doesn't match any database. Flores lowered his voice slightly. He's stable now, but his labs are showing abnormalities we can't fully explain. Elevated inflammatory markers. Unusual coagulation pattern. And a pause. Old scar tissue on the torso. A lot of it, patterned in a way the attending described as not consistent with typical trauma or surgical history. Grace looked at the man on the gurney, at the hands, at the face, at the specific, settled quality of his unconsciousness. Not the slack unconsciousness of someone who had simply lost function, but the contained, almost disciplined quality of someone whose body had made a tactical decision to shut down temporarily. She had seen that quality before. "Room 401, she said. "I'll take it from here." She settled him into 401 with the efficient, economical movements of someone who had set up medical environments under conditions that made a fully equipped ICU look like a luxury. For access, monitoring leads, oxygen titration, neuro checks, she ran through the assessment with the speed of someone who had done it 10,000 times and the attention of someone simultaneously doing something else with another part of her mind. She was reading him, not his chart. Him, the scar tissue on his torso, visible when they transferred him from the gurney, cataloged in 3 seconds before his gown was repositioned. For distinct patterns. The oldest at the left lateral chest, shrapnel. She knew shrapnel scars the way a carpenter knows wood grain. The second, right shoulder, through and through gunshot wound, healed cleanly, properly managed in the field. The third and fourth, abdominal, surgical, deliberate, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing under conditions that were not ideal. She straightened. She looked at his face. His eyes were open. They had not been open 30 seconds ago. Very dark, a deep, almost opaque brown, and looking at her with the specific, assessing focus of someone who had woken up in unfamiliar environments before and had developed a protocol for it. He was running her face through something. A calculation, a recognition sequence. Then something changed in his expression. Fractional. The tiny relaxation of the muscles around the eyes that happens when the brain completes a recognition it wasn't expecting. He knew her face. Grace held very still. "You're awake," she said. Her voice was exactly what it always was, calm, clinical, informative. "You're in the ICU at Meridian General. You were brought in this morning. Your vitals are stable." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his right hand moved, slowly, with the deliberate economy of someone managing significant weakness. It rose from the bed. It found her wrist. It wrapped around it with a grip that was, despite everything his body had just been through, precisely calibrated. Not threatening, not gentle, exact. And he said, in a voice barely above a whisper, but carrying in it the absolute certainty of someone who was not guessing, "I know what you did in Freetown." Grace did not move. This was in itself a decision. Every response in a high-stakes moment is a decision, including the decision not to respond. She had learned this in a classroom that had no walls and no chairs, in a country whose name she had not spoken aloud in 2 years, 1 month, and 17 days. She looked down at his hand on her wrist. She looked at his face. She ran, in the 3 seconds of silence that followed his words, a rapid and comprehensive assessment of what she knew and what she didn't. What she knew: shrapnel scars, a healed gunshot wound, 2 surgical interventions, found unconscious in a hotel room, no identification. He had woken up in an unfamiliar ICU and, within 30 seconds of opening his eyes, had recognized her face and spoken a word that existed in no file in Meridian General system. Freetown. What she didn't know how. "You need to rest," Grace said. Her voice was exactly what it always was. She did not pull her wrist away. "Whatever you need to say can wait until your vitals are more stable." "It can't," he said. His grip did not tighten. It didn't need to. It was already saying everything a tightened grip would say. "I've been looking for you for 4 months, he said, managing pain and urgency simultaneously with the practiced compression of someone who had done it before. "I found you 3 days ago. I was going to make contact today. Someone got there first." Grace looked at the monitoring equipment. Heart rate elevated but stable. Oxygen saturation holding. Whatever had happened to him in that hotel room had been serious but not permanently damaging, which meant someone had wanted him incapacitated, not dead, which was its own specific kind of information. "Who found you?" she said. "Don't know yet. The room was clean when I woke up here. Standard sedation protocol. Fast-acting, minimal residual. Someone with access to pharmaceutical-grade materials. You were sedated. Yes. Not a medical event. No. Outside the room, the ICU continued its morning rhythms. Soft alarms, footsteps, the murmur of the shift change handoff. The ordinary sounds of a building that processed human crisis continuously and had stopped noticing it. Grace became aware, in the specific way that old training resurfaces when the body decides it's needed, that she was running a threat assessment. That her eyes had, without her consciously directing them, swept the room for exits, for sight lines, for the location of the call button relative to her right hand. That she was standing with her weight distributed the way you stand when you might need to move quickly. She had not stood that way in 2 years, 1 month and 17 days. She sat down in the chair beside his bed. Not because she was surrendering to the conversation. Because sitting was tactically correct. It lowered her profile, signaled to anyone observing through the glass that this was a routine patient interaction, and brought her face to his level where she could read him more accurately. "Say what you came to say," she said. Quickly, he looked at her, assessing the way she was assessing him. Both of them running parallel calculations that had nothing to do with the ICU and everything to do with skills neither of them had officially ever possessed. "Sierra Leone," he said. 2009, the Kono District operation. Grace's hands, resting on her knees, did not move. A UN medical convoy was ambushed on the road between Koidu and Tambadu, he continued. 3 vehicles, 11 personnel. The ambush was coordinated, not opportunistic. Someone had advanced intelligence on the convoy's route and timing. He held her gaze. 10 of the 11 were extracted by the rapid response team 40 minutes after the ambush. The 11th, a field medic attached under a civilian contractor cover, was not extracted with the others, because by the time the team arrived, she had already extracted herself. And 6 wounded civilians. And 2 UN peacekeepers who would not have survived the 40-minute wait. The room was very quiet. The after-action report listed the 11th personnel as separated from convoy during ambush, status unknown, he said. That status was never updated in the official record, because the 11th personnel had, by the time anyone thought to look for her, ceased to exist under the identity she'd been using. A pause. The UN has been quietly trying to find her for 15 years. Not to discipline her, to give her something. Grace looked at the window, at the ICU corridor beyond the glass, where Preeti was returning from the Diaz family meeting with the specific expression of someone who has just done something difficult and found that they were capable of it. "You said Freetown," Grace said. "Not Kono. Freetown is where the 6 civilians ended up. At the Kana hospital, treated under assumed names because the woman who brought them and told the admitting staff that their real names were not safe to record. A pause carrying more weight than the others. One of them was a 12-year-old boy. He's 27 now. He's a physician. He practices in Freetown." He looked at her steadily. "He asked me to find you." Something moved in Grace Okonkwo's face. Very small. The fractional adjustment of the muscles around the eyes that happens when the brain receives something it has been braced against for a long time and discovers, in the moment of impact, that the bracing was both necessary and insufficient. She stood up. She checked his foreline. She checked his monitoring leads. She adjusted the oxygen flow with the precise, economical movements of someone performing a task they have done 10,000 times. Her hands did not shake. She was very careful about her hands. "You need fluids and rest," she said. "I'm going to order a full metabolic panel and a toxicology screen. We'll talk more when you're stronger." "Grace," he said. She stopped. He had used her name, not the name on her badge, but the way he said it carried the specific weight of someone who had found it through effort rather than simply reading it off a lanyard. "The boy's name is Samuel," he said. "He became a doctor because of what he saw you do on that road. He said to tell you that he has thought about your hands every day for 15 years. A pause. He said you talked to him while you worked. You told him jokes. Bad ones. He said you laughed at your own jokes." Grace walked to the door. She put her hand on the frame. She stood there for 3 seconds with her back to the room. 3 seconds longer than she needed. The only visible evidence of what the last 4 minutes had cost her. Then she walked out into the ICU corridor and went back to work. Samuel was 27 years old and a physician in Freetown, and he had thought about her hands every day for 15 years. Grace had spent 2 years, 1 month, and 17 days not thinking about Kono. About the road. About the 12-year-old boy she had told bad jokes to while her hand were doing things that kept him alive. She had been very disciplined about not thinking about it. But discipline had a specific vulnerability. It worked perfectly until the thing you weren't thinking about sent someone to find you. And the man in room 401, sedated with pharmaceutical-grade materials, found by someone who moved faster than he did, was not the only person in this hospital who knew what she had done in Freetown. The question was, who else had been listening? The morning passed the way ICU mornings passed, when there were no acute crises. In the particular controlled chaos of 12 people in various states of managed deterioration, each requiring continuous attention, each connected to machines that translated the business of staying alive into numbers and waveforms. Grace did this work with her full attention. She had always been capable of giving her full attention to whatever was in front of her. It was the skill that had made her exceptional at the previous things she had done. The ability to be entirely present in the immediate moment regardless of what else was happening in the background. She checked on room 401 every 40 minutes through the glass. Observed without entering. He was sleeping, genuine sleep, not pharmaceutical unconsciousness. Heart rate regular. Saturation holding at 96%. The toxicology screen came back at 1047. Traces of a fast-acting benzodiazepine analog. Pharmaceutical grade, not recreational, which confirmed what he'd told her about the sedation. Pharmaceutical grade benzodiazepine analogs were not available at pharmacies. They were available to 3 categories of people: medical personnel, certain research institutions, and people who operated in the specific professional spaces that Grace had spent 20 years in before deciding she was done. Someone with operational resources had sedated him, which meant someone with operational resources knew he was looking for her, which meant, with the cold logic of things you know immediately but wish you didn't, that those same resources likely knew he had found her. At 1,100 hours, Dr. Marcus Vale appeared in the ICU corridor. This was unusual. Vale was cardiothoracic surgery. He had no patients on the ICU floor this week. Grace had checked the board that morning, as she always did. He was walking with the slightly distracted purposefulness of someone who had decided to be somewhere and had a justification ready if asked. He stopped at the nurse's station. He spoke to the ward clerk. Grace watched from the medication room doorway. The exchange was brief. The clerk checked the board, shook her head slightly, responded. Grace went to the ward clerk after Vale left. "Does he have a consult up here?" she said. Mild, professional, completely uninformative about the nature of the question. The ward clerk shook her head. He was asking about the new admission. Room 401. Whether the patient had been identified yet. Grace processed this. Vale had no clinical reason to ask about room 401. He was not on the consult list. He was not the attending. He had no connection to the patient by any route that appeared in any record in this hospital. But he had asked, which meant someone had told him the patient was here, which meant the information had moved faster than it should have through a channel that was not the standard communication pathway of a civilian hospital. She returned to the medication room. She completed the medication reconciliation she had been in the middle of. She did not allow her face to change because the ICU corridor had glass walls, and glass walls were, in her experience, one of the more underestimated surveillance vulnerabilities in any institutional setting. She thought about Elena Montoya. She had passed Elena in the corridor 2 days ago, the day after the for incident that had been generating quiet, fragmented conversation throughout the hospital ever since. She had not introduced herself. She had not needed to. She had seen Elena's hands and understood, with the specific recognition of someone who knew exactly what they were looking at, what those hands meant. What kind of person moved through the world with that particular combination of stillness and readiness? She had thought then, there is someone else here. She was thinking now, And whoever is paying attention to that someone is also paying attention to me. The crisis arrived at 1347. Room 407. Mrs. Clarence, 71. 3 days post-cardiac bypass, supposed to be stabilizing. Her monitor alarm changed pitch. Not the standard arrhythmia alert. The specific lower-frequency tone that indicated a pressure alarm. Grace was through the door before the second alert cycle. Mrs. Clarence was in respiratory distress. Oxygen saturation dropping, 91, 89, falling. Breathing labored, asymmetrical. Left side moving, right side not. Pleural effusion. Post-surgical accumulation of fluid around the right lung, compressing it from the outside. Manageable if you moved immediately. Give me a thoracentesis kit, Grace said to Preeti in the doorway. Now, and page Dr. Harrison. He's in a procedure. At least 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Grace looked at Mrs. Clarence. At the saturation, 87 and still falling. At the respiratory effort, the specific, exhausting labor of a body trying to breathe through a lung that had been pushed aside. At the time she did not have 20 minutes. She thought about the thoracentesis kit, about the procedure, needle into the pleural space, fluid out, lung re-expands, patient breathes. She had done it before, not in an ICU, in settings considerably less forgiving. She thought about Elena Montoya, setting down an instrument tray and walking to a table. Bring me the kit, Grace said. Grace had done a thoracentesis for the first time at the age of 26, in the back of a Land Cruiser moving at 60 kilometers per hour on a dirt road outside Monrovia. With a modified forecatheter and a syringe she had improvised from what was in the field kit. The patient had been a 22-year-old peacekeeper named Adebayo who had taken shrapnel to the chest. He had been in respiratory distress for 11 minutes by the time she got to him. The driver refused to stop the vehicle. Grace had straddled Adebayo's chest in the back of the moving vehicle, found the intercostal space by touch in the dark, and drained 400 milliliters of blood from his pleural cavity with a device that no physician in a civilian hospital would have recognized as medical equipment. Adebayo had survived. The thoracentesis kit at Meridian General was significantly more sophisticated. It had a proper drainage needle, a collection system, an ultrasound guide she set up in 45 seconds. Mrs. Clarence, despite her distress, was cooperative. Grace had spoken to her in the specific tone she used for frightened patients, the tone that communicated without words. I know exactly what I'm doing, and you're going to be fine. You're going to feel pressure, Grace told her. Not pain. Pressure. Keep your eyes on me. Mrs. Clarence looked at Grace's face and made the decision that people make when they are frightened and in pain, and someone presents them with the specific, grounded quality of competence that asks for trust. She nodded. Grace positioned the needle. She found the space, 6th intercostal midaxillary line, above the rib margin to avoid the neurovascular bundle, the way you found it when you had found it 100 times before. She inserted the needle. She felt the resistance of tissue, then the specific, unmistakable give of the pleural space. Fluid began to drain. Straw-colored, not blood. Post-surgical effusion. It drained steadily. Mrs. Clarence's respiratory effort gradually easing as the pressure on her right lung released. Oxygen saturation, 84, 86, 88, 90, 92. Mrs. Clarence took a breath. A real breath, the kind her body had been fighting for, and the profound relief of a body that has been given back what it needs moved across her face like a light coming on. There, Grace said quietly. There you go. 600 milliliters total. She withdrew the needle, sealed the site, applied the dressing. Saturation 94 and climbing. Respiratory effort normalized. She stripped her gloves. She turned around. Dr. Harrison was standing in the doorway. He looked at the drainage collection system, at Mrs. Clarence, visibly stabilized, at Grace's face. She was at 84 and dropping. Grace said, before he could speak, "You were 20 minutes out. I made a clinical decision." Harrison looked at the drainage volume, at the saturation reading, at the site dressing on Mrs. Clarence's chest, perfectly applied by any objective standard. "That's a physician procedure," he said carefully. "Yes," Grace said. "Your scope of practice." was not sufficient for what the situation required. I'm aware. Harrison performed his own assessment, the automatic reflexive assessment of a physician re-establishing clinical ownership of a patient. He checked the saturation. He listened to the chest. He reviewed the drainage. He looked at Grace again. "Where did you learn to do that?" he said. Grace began cleaning up the procedure materials. "Continuing education," she said. Harrison was quiet for a long moment. "I'll write the procedure note under my name. Given the circumstances, that's the most straightforward approach." "Thank you." "Grace." He stopped at the door. "Whatever your background is, I don't need to know. But Mrs. Clarence is alive right now because you made the right call." He paused. "That matters more than the scope of practice question." He left. Grace stood in the room for a moment. She looked at Mrs. Clarence, whose breathing had taken on the slow, regular rhythm of genuine sleep for the first time in 3 days. She thought about Adebayo in the back of a moving Land Cruiser, about the darkness and the noise, and the improvised catheter and the decision she had made in that moment. The same decision, separated by 18 years and considerably more resources, but structurally identical. She went to check on room 401. It was empty. The bed was made. The monitoring equipment had been disconnected. Properly, not hastily. The leads coiled and placed on the equipment stand the way a person places things when they have time and intention rather than urgency. The four had been removed and the site dressed. On the bedside table was a single folded piece of paper. Grace picked it up. On it were 2 things, a phone number with a Freetown area code, and below it, in handwriting that was precise and controlled, and completely unlike the shaking hand of the sedated man who had arrived that morning. She said the jokes were terrible, but she laughed and so did he. "Samuel says thank you. They know you're here. Leave tonight." Grace stood in room 401 for exactly 60 seconds. She read the note twice. By the end of the second reading, she had made 3 decisions. Decision 1. She was not leaving tonight. Not because the note was wrong about the risk, but these were her patients. They had nobody else tonight. Decision 2. She needed to know what Vale knew and how he knew it. Decision 3. She needed to talk to Elena Montoya. She documented room 401 as AMA, against medical advice, 1,423 hours. Accurate, complete, telling the institutional story correctly without telling any other story at all. She found Elena in the corridor outside the surgical services equipment room at 1532. Elena was completing an inventory count. She looked up when Grace approached with the specific, assessing attention of someone who sees everything and has long since stopped being obvious about it. They looked at each other. Grace had thought about how to begin this conversation. She had decided the most efficient approach was also the most honest one, because they were both people who wasted very little, and dishonesty was a form of waste. "I saw your hands 2 days ago," Grace said. "In the corridor, after or for?" Elena said nothing. "I know what hands like that mean," Grace said. "I have hands like that." "I know," Elena said. "Someone is paying attention to this hospital. To us. Specifically." Grace held Elena's gaze. "I had an unusual admission this morning. The patient had information about my past that shouldn't exist in any accessible record. He was sedated before he could get to me. Pharmaceutical grade, operational resources. He left AMA before I could fully debrief him." A pause. Marcus Vale asked about him within 4 hours of admission. Something shifted in Elena's expression. "Small. Significant." "Vale," Elena said. "No clinical connection to the patient. He asked whether he'd been identified. He already knew the answer when I told him the patient had left." Elena was quiet. She looked at the inventory clipboard in her hands. She placed it on the shelf with the same precise alignment she placed everything. "Director Hollis," Elena said. "The woman who came here 2 days ago. She said the people who want the records destroyed have operational resources. She said the invisibility I'd been relying on was no longer available." "She said that to you specifically?" "Yes." Grace thought about this. "Foster," she said. Elena looked at her. "The hospital administrator. Colonel Diane Foster, retired. She hired me." A pause. "I've been wondering, since the morning I started here, whether that was a coincidence." Elena looked at her for a long moment. something assembling in her expression, arriving at a more complete picture. She hired me too, Elena said quietly. The corridor was very quiet. She hired both of us, Grace said. It was not a question. That evening, Grace sat by her apartment window and allowed herself, for the first time in 2 years, 1 month and 17 days, to think about Freetown. Not the operational details, not the road or the ambush or the mechanics of what she had done. She thought about the boy, about the specific, terrible fear in his eyes when she reached him. The fear of a 12-year-old who had understood, with the complete and unsparing comprehension of a child in a war zone, that he might die in the next few minutes. And how that fear had shifted, not disappeared, shifted into a watchful, desperate attention, the attention of someone who has decided that if they're going to survive this, they're going to pay attention to every second of it. She had told him jokes. She had not planned to. It had simply been what she did. What her hands were doing was what needed doing, and her mouth had decided independently that what the situation needed was a terrible joke about a doctor and a mango that her colleague Marcus had told her 3 weeks before. She had laughed at it when Marcus told it. It had lodged in her memory the way things lodge when you are very tired and something strikes you as unexpectedly funny. She had laughed at her own joke. The boy had, despite everything, almost smiled. She picked up her phone and called the Freetown number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice, young, careful, with the specific educated English of someone who had done their medical training in a British-influenced institution. "Hello," the voice said. "This is Grace," she said. A silence. The kind of silence that carries 27 years of accumulated weight and doesn't know quite where to put it. "I know," Samuel said. His voice was very careful. "I know who this is." "You became a doctor," she said. "Yes, because of what I saw you do. Because I decided that if someone could do that, could do what you did in those circumstances and still tell terrible jokes," a pause. "I decided I wanted to spend my life being the kind of person who did that." "The jokes were bad," she said. "They were very bad," he agreed. And she could hear in his voice, across the years and the distance, the almost smile. The mango one especially. Grace made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. "Are you safe?" Samuel asked. His voice changed. The careful deference of a young man speaking to someone he had mythologized, giving way to the direct, professional concern of a physician who had been told there was a risk. "For now," Grace said. "Thank you for sending him." Even if his timing was imperfect, Samuel said. "Yes, I'm sorry. We moved as fast as we could when we realized the other party was also looking." "Who is the other party?" A silence. "People who do not want the Kono operation documented. People who have an interest in certain UN records remaining classified." Another pause. "What you and the other medics did on that road, it is evidence of what was happening on the ground that day. Evidence that contradicts the official version." "I'll need time to think about this," Grace said. "I know. Take what you need." "But Grace," a pause. "You saved my life, and then you disappeared before I could even know your name. I spent 15 years thinking about what I would say if I ever found you." Another pause. "I just want you to know that it mattered. What you did. It mattered more than you will ever completely understand." Grace sat with this. "The joke," she said. "The mango one. Do you still remember it?" A beat. "Yes," Samuel said. And this time she could hear the smile clearly, all these years later, grown into something fuller than an almost. "It was terrible." "Yes," Grace said. "It was." She does not tell the story of Freetown. Not to her colleagues, who know her as unshakable. Not to her patients, who know her as the nurse who explains exactly what she knows and exactly what she doesn't. Not to the physicians who watch her work and occasionally ask, carefully, where she learned to do that. Continuing education, she tells them. What she does not tell them is that the education happened on dirt roads and in borrowed vehicles and in rooms with no roofs, in the specific and irreversible classroom of situations where the wrong answer meant someone died. What she does not tell them is that the stillness they find so remarkable is not a natural condition. It is a constructed one, built deliberately, maintained continuously, at a cost that doesn't appear on any balance sheet. What she does not tell them is that somewhere in Freetown, a 27-year-old physician makes the same careful, exact movements with his hands that he watched her make on a dirt road when he was 12 years old. And that every time he does, he thinks of her. She is unshakable. She has worked very hard at that. And on the nights when the work is harder, when the ICU is quiet and the building hums its continuous, unsleeping hum, and she stands at the nurse's station in the particular aloneness of the last person awake, she thinks about a boy who almost smiled at a terrible joke. And she thinks that was enough. That was always enough. 3 days after the events of this episode, Dr. Priya Kapoor stopped Grace Okonkwo in the 4th floor corridor. She did not ask about room 401. She did not mention Freetown. She simply said, "I've been paying attention." And then, "I think there are more of you." Grace looked at her for a long moment. More of us doing what? Kapoor looked at the corridor around them, at the building that had been doing something else simultaneously, something none of them had been meant to see. "Hiding," Kapoor said. What Dr. Priya Kapoor does with what she's been watching, and who comes to her door because of it, begins in episode 5.